The argument was that that when you look at what government ought to be, that's not a question that can be answered the same way all of the time. That the principles of government ought to reflect the different circumstances and the different historical pressures. And so their view was that even though that's a very limited understanding of government, constitutional government may have been appropriate for the times of the founding, this was well beyond 100 years after that philosophy was dominant. Things had changed, all kinds of new pressures, all kinds of circumstances the framers could not have foreseen, and therefore government needed to change.
Hi, this is Tony Williams, Senior Fellow at the Bill of Rights Institute, and we are pleased to bring you another episode of Scholar Talks. For this episode, we're honored to have on scholar Ronald J. Pestritto, who is going to discuss his new book, America Transformed: The Rise and Legacy of American Progressivism, and here it is. The guiding question for this episode is, how did the philosophy and policies of the progressive era transform the role of American government from the American founding? And Dr. Ronald J. Pestritto is Dean of the Van Andel Graduate School of Statesmanship and Professor of Politics at Hillsdale College. He holds the Charles and Lucia Shipley Chair in the American Constitution. And Dr. Pestritto is the author and editor of several excellent books, several of which adorn my shelves, including Woodrow Wilson and the Roots of Modern Liberalism, and several other books on the progressive era and American founding. RJ, I want to thank you for joining me.
Thanks for inviting me. Really glad to be doing something for the Bill of Rights Institute.
Great.
Looking forward to our conversation.
Great. Well, I really love America Transformed. It's a collection of some really thought-provoking essays, but really tightly bound together. Really reads like a narrative book, and really has some really important things to say about the American founding and about progressivism. So if you're ready, we'll get started. So before assessing the ways that progressives might have transformed politics from the American founding, can you please just briefly give us a review of the important characteristics and important principles that you see characterizing the American founding?
That's a loaded question, of course. I teach whole courses on that.
Right.
But I think, of course, understanding that there are lots of different people involved in the founding, but if you kind of think of the public documents and sort of the public philosophy that gets presented and what seems to be sort of basic consensus views, you have a political system that has to be understood within the context of the moral law, what they call the natural law. And when they were debating, what kind of government is right for human beings, that's what they consulted, and that's an old tradition in political thought. And so they understood the natural law to be a source of both duties and rights. And if you look at the Declaration of Independence, just government is defined as a government that secures certain rights that inhere in man because of his nature, that come from the law of nature, life, liberty, property. And so that's they understood government that way. The point of it was the securing of the natural rights of individuals. That if it didn't do that, it was not legitimate. It's part of the argument against the British. And that they understood human beings to be equal in these rights. Not equal in every other respect, of course. By nature, we're all very, very different, but equal in our rights. And so because of that, then legitimate government could only be based on consent. The idea of no man being able to govern another without the other's consent, that sort of comes from the law of nature. And so, if you want to sort of get it set up for looking at the progressives, I think the important thing to stress about the founding was, for them, government was limited. It was limited to this purpose in order to be legitimate. Doesn't necessarily mean government was small in every respect. That's sometimes a mistake that I think people on the right tend to make. But with respect to the exercise of its powers, it had to be limited in scope, limited on the ends that people had consented to. And that's really, I think, an important contrast to the progressives, because the Constitution reflects those limited ends, those purposes. And so you have a kind of structure, a political science in the Constitution: separation of powers, federalism, checks and balances, independent judiciary, all the things that you see discussed in the Federalist Papers. These are things that are there to reflect these basic natural rights purposes of government. And that's what you see the progressives really starting to question. That's what they're chafing against, is the constitutional restrictions. And if they're coming up against those restrictions, they know they have to also kind of go at the deeper, the core philosophy that gave rise to that constitutional structure.
Right. And well, thank you for the succinct summary of the founding in about 3 minutes. I know we can do an entire course, and we have an entire library of materials here at BRI on the founding. But that's very helpful, because and also is a great segue to setting up my next question, which is, in general, what were some of the guiding ideas then of the progressives at the beginning of the 20th century, and how do they challenge the constitutional order that you were just describing of the American founding?
Yeah, I think that the progressives, or progressivism, the basic idea, if you'll pardon the use of the term, to in its own definition, is to progress, or to kind of get beyond, to move beyond the original principles of the country. And the argument was that that when you look at what government ought to be, that's not a question that can be answered the same way all of the time. That the principles of government ought to reflect the different circumstances and the different historical pressures. And so their view was that even though that's a very limited understanding of government, constitutional government may have been appropriate for the times of the founding, this was well beyond 100 years after that philosophy was dominant. Things had changed, all kinds of new pressures, all kinds of circumstances the framers could not have foreseen, and therefore government needed to change, and not just change in its particular means. The framers would have agreed with that. They certainly would have. Didn't think that their ideas about government that were frozen in time, but the sort of the core purpose, right? That's what they thought was a sort of timeless, a timeless principle. So the progressives, they thought that the Constitution, therefore, the structure was outdated. They had a vision for a much more robust federal government in terms of regulation, in terms of redistribution of wealth. They knew that the Constitution's political science stood in the way of that. And you see that in a lot of the judicial disputes that take place, for example, during this time. And so it's a very common feature of progressive era writings to see sort of thoughtful, sustained critiques of the idea of natural rights, the idea of social compact, the idea of limited constitutional government, separation of powers. Criticisms of these things are sprinkled all throughout progressive era writings. So for people who are interested in getting into the principles of government and the purpose of government, and what reading the progressives is really interesting, because they're not just talking about policy. They're really getting at these fundamental questions and laying out, and they're very open about laying out very novel, radically different views of what government should be.
Right. Transformative, as the title of your book mentions.
As it suggests, yes.
Right. Okay, and so digging into a few of these progressives, we don't have time to do all of them. You have a lot of great sketches in there, and analyses of various progressives. But let's hone in on two particularly, and probably well known for our audience. you argue that Presidents Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson were two important progressives who rejected several key points, as you just mentioned, of the American founding to create that strong presidency, to create a national regulatory state run by experts. Can you maybe go into that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, Wilson and Roosevelt, I think, those are the two, in a quick discussion of the book, those are the two to focus on. Those are the ones that, those are the prominent national progressives. I have a chapter in the book on state and local progressivism, which is actually an area where it was probably even more influential, but they're definitely, I think, the ones to focus on. And they contested the 1912 election, which was all about progressivism in one way or another. And so they, in these characters, you see what I consider to be the two pretty distinct prongs of the progressive argument. One prong being a push for greater democratization. The argument that the framers distrusted the people, they were fearful about overactive government, and so they put a lot of distance between the people and actual policymaking. And so you get all kinds of institutions and representative institutions, mechanisms, ways of filtering out popular passions. Famously, the Federalists were very worried about this. And the progressive view of that was that human nature was not the danger that the framers thought it was at their time. History had cured that problem by and large, they thought. And so you could have a more directly democratic form of government. So that's one prong. Kind of going in the other direction, the other prong is, however, when you have the national government getting into now so much regulation and so many new facets of American life and economics, obviously the original legislature that is established to do all of the rulemaking is not up to this task. And so you have the creation of a sort of independent and a very large bureaucracy of alleged experts. And the progressive call, on the one hand, while they wanted more democratization, the government, the institutions that they wanted democratized were also made much less powerful, because so much real power for governing, for policymaking, was removed from political institutions altogether and placed in the hands of a kind of bureaucratic elite. And this is a concept that's grown, over the decades, and I think you can probably see that if people didn't understand how that worked prior to 2020, the fact that all of our lives have been run by unelected, public health officials for the last 2 years, I think it should bring the idea home very clearly.
Great. And so in a maybe lesser known, but very important part of progressivism, you described the social gospel movement and how it might have challenged traditional religion from sort of a heavenly paradise and focus on salvation to more of an earthly paradise, maybe achieved more through social justice. Can you unpack that?
By and large, the progressives were very religious, and much of their progressivism was driven by a very fervent Christianity. And it's, in a way, to quote the Blues Brothers, a lot of the progressives thought they were on a mission from God. I'm old enough where that reference might make sense. I'm aging myself there, obviously, for maybe some of your younger viewers, but in any event, that this is where you see progressivism was really bound up with the important religious movement on the left at that time, which was social gospel. And social gospel was a kind of a combination of sort of Hegelianism, the philosophy of history, evolution, with a sort of liberal form of Protestant Christianity. And so the progressives weren't always social gospelers, and the social gospelers weren't always progressives, but the two movements were very interrelated. And social gospel was essentially, after when you get the Darwinian Revolution in the 19th century, the Protestant church reacts in two very different ways. You have the Orthodox reaction, which is to reassert the fundamentals of the faith. That's where the term fundamentalism comes from. But you have the liberal reaction, which was to see evolution as a moment for change. And so, and that really is what became social gospel, and a challenge to a lot of the traditional Christian doctrines like original sin and so on. The idea that man's not permanently fallen. I get the political significance of this is, if man is not permanently fallen, then we are capable here on earth through human work of making a paradise for ourselves. And that's where I think social gospel and progressivism really do kind of come together. So that's a very, I think, inarticulate and overly short way of putting that, but that's as best I can do under the pressure of time.
No, it's great, and as is the description in the book. So our last question. You describe how this progressive administrative state might have undermined these principles of separation of powers, federalism, these founding principles, to take governance away more from Congress and the people. And you describe kind of the course of that over the 20th century into the 21st century. What impact has this made over governance over the last 125 years?
Yeah, as I said earlier, I think unfortunately, we're in great times to see this, because the argument here, by the progressives was that increasingly rulemaking, lawmaking, rules that have the force of law, rules you have to obey or you're in trouble. These things are increasingly technical. Our society is increasingly complex, and so people that we vote for, people in politics, are increasingly less capable of making all of these rules and regulations. And so, I think that, just if you look around you at the way most policy questions are debated and dealt with today, not just COVID policy, that's an obvious example, but environmental policy, immigration policy, healthcare policy. Most of the rules and the policies that affect us are not made by elected officials anymore. They're made by unelected officials who are delegated broad swaths of power in some very vague ways. Think of the Obamacare Act, for example. Think of the OSHA Act, which now has allowed OSHA to claim authority to mandate vaccination all over the country. These are very broad, very vague, just sort of grants of authority, with the idea being the experts will figure it out. The difficulty there, of course, is you have very, very impactful policies that are made by people who are not elected. And as we started our conversation, talking about, consent is a fundamental requirement for the legitimacy of government. And so this is a real problem in a republic, right? Just to bring it home, the idea that you have an unelected lifelong bureaucrat like Tony Fauci, who has far more to say today about what you can do in your life than any elected member of our Congress, for example. That's kind of where we are. And is there a direct line for progressivism? Of course not, because history doesn't work that way. History is complicated, but there's a lot of indirect connection for sure.
Right, and as a follow-up, you describe in the book how a lot of these agencies have taken on not only executive power, but the legislative power, and then also the judicial power to adjudicate their own rulings. So there's just no separation of powers, and sort of what happens to liberty of the people.
Agents, right? It's not efficient. Separation of powers is not efficient. If you were to design an efficient system, you would not have done what James Madison did. Now, yes, they wanted the system to do more than it had under the Articles of Confederation. That's true. But when you have the fathers of the modern administrative state, they want to take all of the power and place it in a single set of expert hands. And so you would have those responsible for making rules be who better to know whom to investigate than those who made the rules. And then who better to know if there's actually been a violation than those who did the investigating and the charging. And so you have most of the independent regulatory commissions that exercise all three powers of government. And sometimes, it's funny these days, I have to remind students about why something like the separation of powers is actually important, why this might be a problem for liberty. The policeman who accuses you of a crime doesn't get up on the bench during your trial and decide whether you're guilty. That's actually not how it works. We have things like rule of law. There has to be rules in advance made by people who are different than those who are enforcing them, so the enforcers don't get to make up the rules as they go. And the history of the administrative state, unfortunately, is full of these kinds of very problematic developments for liberty. And you're seeing a bit of a reassessment of that, I think, going on in the courts right now. I don't know where that's going to end up, but there's a bit of a reassessment. This week, I think maybe even today, as we're recording this, the vaccine cases are up before the Supreme Court, and the question of the discretionary power of unelected administrative agencies is front and center in those cases, for example. So,
very good. Well, the book is America Transformed, The Rise and Legacy of American Progressivism. And so, R.J. Pestritto, I want to thank you very much for joining us.
Happy to do it, and really happy to be participating with BRI.
Great, thank you. And thank you all for joining us on this episode of Scholar Talks. Please check out our series and large and growing collection of videos on various topics, but our series include pivotal battles in American history, the Cold War and the presidency, and Black intellectuals and the African American experience. So check out all those great videos on YouTube, and thank you for joining us.